aren't many franchises that could appeal to as many different tastes as Resident Evil. It's done so many different things since 1996, from classic tank control survival horror to action-packed third-person co-op shooter, and more recently first-person frights and loads of wild spin-offs along the way. It's Capcom's consistent willingness to try something different that has made Resident Evil so malleable. However, with each evolution comes the risk of making dreadfully wrong decisions. And despite being where we're at today, where arguably the Resident Evil franchise is in better health than it's ever been, there have been so many times when Capcom have nearly made a choice that could have put the series in a shallow grave. In this video, I'm going to take a look at 3 of the biggest games in the RE series and tell the story of how they nearly didn't become the masterpieces we know them to be. Because I'm Sai, this is What Culture, and this is the untold history of Resident Evil. Or how Capcom nearly killed Resident Evil. In order to tell the story of the original Resident Evil properly, we need to go back, way back, to a time when people thought pocket calculators were pretty nifty. In the 1980s, the company had some success with the likes of Ghosts and Goblins, Final Fight, and the 1940X vertical shooter series. Memorably, they developed a strong relationship with Disney and began publishing a number of their games as far back as 1987's Mickey Mousecapade, starring the Big Cheese himself. Which, by the way, is basically Mickey's first proper video game, so I guess what I'm saying is he should be teaming up with Dante, Dalsim, and the Nemesis in the next Capcom crossover fighting game. It's about time. Anyway, that same year, Capcom became one of the few third-party companies to have a truly recognisable mascot of their own in Mega Man. The challenging and addictive platformer became the studio's bread and butter. Despite all of this, Capcom hit a major snag. According to Yoshiki Okamoto, who was a very major player at the company during this period, Capcom was on the verge of financial collapse. It seems unthinkable, but even with these successes and deals in place, and numbers for those times are obviously hard to come by, the company was somehow in jeopardy. Thankfully for them, Okamoto had been developing a strip mahjong game called Mahjong Gaoken. Yes, as in an electronic version of the popular Chinese tile placing game, but with pixelated nudity. Capcom president Kenji Tsujimoto refused to put the company name on it, and so it was released under the publisher name Yuga. And incredibly, it went on to outdo the sequel to Ghosts and Goblins, Ghouls and Ghosts, and become one of the top 10 most successful arcade games of 1988. And the money that it did make was folded back into the company. Mahjong Gaoken saving Capcom from bankruptcy more than anything from a retrospective view might have inspired them to take some pretty out there risks in the future. Sure, they hadn't published the game as Capcom, but the unexpected idea had saved the company, and it proved that outside chances were worth taking, as were leaning on other business models. You know, like how in 1994 they invented Bowlingo, apparently, which blew my mind to discover. If you don't know what Bowlingo is, it's basically miniature bowling. Smaller balls, smaller pins, smaller lanes, so they could squeeze as many as possible into all the buildings down the British coastline. And Japanese arcades, I suppose. In 1991, the company released the not at all long-awaited, because the first game wasn't very good, sequel, Street Fighter 2, for the first of a gazillion and one times. Street Fighter blew up, perhaps even bigger than Mega Man had, essentially replacing the Blue Bomber as Capcom's marquee series. And Capcom did, of course, what Capcom was already known for doing. It put Ryu and company to the grindstone, sharpening Street Fighter 2 to a point over and over, releasing the likes of Champion Edition and Turbo in 92, New Challengers in 93, and Super Turbo in 94. With, of course, diminishing returns. But unlike the disaster waiting to happen of the waning interest in Mega Man being combated by the release of Street Fighter 2, Capcom didn't have its next big property on the horizon. The likes of Street Fighter Alpha, Mega Man X, and Disney's Toy Story would definitely help, but there was a bigger problem facing them. Secretly, I did this whole section just because I wanted to talk about how Capcom was saved from financial doom by releasing a nudie game, but we can talk about Resident Evil now, I promise. In the early to mid-1990s, there was a sudden rise in the cost of video game production, with the new generation of consoles in the Sega Saturn, Nintendo 64, and for this particular tale, the Sony PlayStation arriving on the market. Things were changing. 3D gaming was finally around the corner, and Capcom, like many companies, had to adapt. And this is purely speculation, but if you look at their output at the time, it seemed like they were hesitant to do so. Both of their two classic series might have jumped to these consoles consoles, but they did so whilst staying 2D for a time, despite some art style changes. The first 3D Street Fighter, which was Street Fighter EX, wasn't even developed directly by Capcom, and was instead made by a company called Eureka. Mega Man Legends, the first 3D outing for that character, wouldn't start development for at least a few years. Perhaps because this is what Capcom knew and felt more comfortable with, perhaps they were unsure on the quality of early 3D games, and also quite possibly because yes, they were expensive to produce. Kenzo Sugimoto, who was mentioned earlier, it should be noted, is the man behind the company from day one until the present day. He founded Capcom in 1979, transferring from IREM Entertainment, which was also his creation, becoming director, which he still holds the chair for 40 years later. Sugimoto, ever the shrewd businessman, has not limited himself to electronic entertainment. In the 90s, he bought land in the Napa Valley of California from Capcom Holdings, where he set up a separate business in Kenzo Estate Winery. Firstly, this was a boost of 7 billion yen back into Capcom on the purchase of the land alone, but several years later, Sugimoto's other venture would contribute funds to prop up the company. Perhaps Sugimoto had been inspired by the out-of-the-box thinking of Strip Mahjong and Bowlingo. Bowlingo. I just can't. And so back at Capcom, the company could continue its hard work on their first new 3D IP. This is an appropriate time to introduce another major name from Capcom at the time. Tokuro Fujiwara was the producer on Resident Evil, but perhaps more importantly, the director of 1989 NES game Sweet Home. As you're likely to be aware, as it's every Resident Evil trivia video's favourite fact, RE started off as a successor to Sweet Home. Fujiwara wanted essentially a second shot at the concept, and a new system would allow him to do a lot more visually. After all, there's only so much scariness you can get across in a horror game with only 8-bit sprites to work with. A tie-in to a film, Sweet Home starred a group of documentary filmmakers navigating a spooky mansion, solving puzzles, dealing with limited supplies, and fighting monsters. Hey, that sounds a lot like Resident Evil, except, less camcorders and more rocket launchers. And it was one of the very few games that could be called anything close to horror. The other, of course, was 1992's Alone in the Dark. This had a big impact on the development of Resident Evil, which went into production in 1993. Whilst the first 6 months were director Shinji Mikami, a young upstart at Capcom hand-selected by Fujiwara, writing pages of script and concepting characters, when the gameplay ideas began to take shape, it was Alone in the Dark that inspired the fixed camera to give the game a more cinematic presentation. Shinji Mikami originally wanted the game to be first person, but it wasn't really feasible, and the team had to re-evaluate and choose a new path forwards. But Resident Evil almost didn't happen at all, first person or not. In a parallel universe too dreadful to think about, the series never even gets started, and the first game becomes a kind of novelty in gaming history books that we all look at and go, remember that Capcom thing that never came out? Probably rubbish. With the company struggling to remain out of the red even with donations from the Kenzo estate, Capcom sought advice from an American financial expert. Apparently, this person took a look at the studio's upcoming slate. Despite this being late 1995 and the game nearing completion, they suggested that Biohazard be, like so many Umbrella test subjects, callously disposed of. It had been in production for nearly 3 years by this point, which by 1996 standards was a long time, and in its last stages of production had between 60 to 80 members of staff putting their time into it. All of this to say it had made some strong demands of Capcom's time, energy and funds into something that was a total unknown. Fujiwara was incensed after putting his all into this dream project, and with the finishing line in sight, he went to bat for the game. Executives were ready to pull the plug, and many developers tended to believe that the game would fail. Fujiwara insisted that Capcom see Resident Evil to release, and being that he had a certain amount of sway in the company, he got his wish. The team stayed the course at Fujiwara's insistence. On March 22nd, 1996, the game was released to almost immediate success. This can be attributed to many things, but perhaps the biggest was that there was nothing like it out there, and the word of mouth spread about the game was massive. Adults and kids alike both talked about it around the cooler or on the playground, swapping tales of harrowing escapes, devastating deaths, puzzles solved, creatures encountered, and windows smashed as dogs pounced upon your character, who You span in circles and ran into the wall as you tried to pilot them out of the room. A video game that was scary! It's really no surprise that Resident Evil flew off shelves, as it scratched an itch that not many games could. Within 6 months or less, Resident Evil had become the console's best seller. By the end of the PlayStation's lifespan, it ended in the top 20 with over 5 million units shifted, a lot more than Fujiwara's original expectation of 200,000. Today it's recognised as the game that broke new ground, inspiring endless clones and setting the stage for one of Capcom's most successful franchises. It was nominated 3 times for the Video Game Hall of Fame before finally making it in 2024. Its success was never assured, and without it the company might not have survived, so it's a good thing that Fujiwara drew a line in the sand and demanded that RE make it over it. Nonetheless, Resident Evil is regarded as one of the most important titles ever, and of course Capcom knew that the series was their best ticket to staying financially sound. Bet that financial advisor feels silly now. And so, immediately, a prequel book, an American novelization by S.D. Perry, some comics and some audio dramas were put into production alongside conversations for the next game. One of these, proposed by Okamoto himself, was Biohazard Dash. By having the player revisit a destroyed version of the mansion from the original, now taken back by the nature of the Arklay forest around it, this would have allowed the studio to reuse assets and get it out into the salivating jaws of paying customers a lot quicker. Easier to produce, but maybe not as fulfilling. Instead, Capcom collectively put on their big business pants and decided all hands would be on deck for a proper follow-up. And now for a non sequitur. Shinji Mikami is a man who doesn't like sequels. After all, Mikami was a student of Fujiwara, who had left Capcom sometime between Resident Evil being greenlit for release again, but before the actual release itself, after he noticed the pattern of Capcom franchising their IPs and favouring these over new ideas. Which is pretty rich, coming from a guy who wanted to remake his NES game for the PS1, but whatever. In all of his career, Mikami has only ever directed a single sequel, and for what it's worth, a single remake, both Resident Evil games, coincidentally. Still, being a man who was himself picked rather unexpectedly to direct the original game, he presumably wanted to pay that opportunity forward. His choice for director in Resident Evil 2 was absolutely with merit, too. How does Hideki Kamiya strike you? Presumably with a crazy combo system, or a limb dismemberment mechanic, or just an indiscriminate block on social media. The future Platinum Games mastermind at the time, however, was quite inexperienced, having only worked as a planner on the original Resi and Arthur Tuno Astaroth no Nazo Makaimura, a 1996 Ghosts and Goblins puzzle spin-off. Suddenly, here he was, being handed the keys to Capcom's new money-making baby. Note to self, change that phrase. Babies don't make money. That's against child labour laws. Resident Evil 2's graphics and presentation were due to be vastly improved over the original, with more enemies appearing on screen and a lead boss monster that transformed over the course of the story. It was decided this story would take place in Raccoon City, specifically in the police station that the stars, pun intended, of the original game worked out of. However, they were nowhere to be seen, and instead the game would be led by a rookie cop and a young biker facing down the horrors of the undead apocalypse. Over the course of the game, they would encounter other survivors such as cops like Roy and an umbrella scientist called Linda, and fight zombie apes. If you played Resident Evil 2, you know that sounds faintly like the game, but also not quite. And if you knew about the Sweet Home thing, you probably also know about the 1.5 thing. The Resident Evil 2 that we got infamously was not necessarily the same game that was put into production in the spring of '96. Despite so many familiar elements that are carried between them, Kamiya's original scenario for RE2 wasn't clicking. Mikami, like his mentor, who had taken a reduced role as producer, was checking in on the project every month or so. It was expected that RE2 would launch in May of '97, but as the months drew closer, it became increasingly obvious that the product was not up to the standards that its leads were expecting for a follow-up to Capcom's biggest ever hit. Which was obviously a problem. Gaming moved faster in the 90s. Heck, Crash Bandicoot kicked off his original trilogy 6 months after RE1 and finished it less than a year after RE2. Fans were hungry for more already, and by May of '97, Resi likes were already cropping up to satiate it. Additionally, it would have been potentially confusing optically to make broad changes. The company had already shown footage from the game at conventions like V-Jump 96, and more than this, die-hard players who had bought the director's cut re-release of the game in Japan, that Capcom had released in the meantime to keep the brand in the conversation, had received a second disc that contained a sneak peek. Players physically owned a look at the game they were presumably excited for because, yeah, on the surface, Resident Evil 2 looked very exciting. Perhaps most importantly, from a monetary standpoint, Capcom would be taking a huge risk by throwing a project which was reportedly between 60 to 80% complete away and starting all over again. But in the spring of '97, that's essentially what they did. Kamiya stayed on as director, but his original story was given to an established screenwriter by the name of Noboru Shigemura. All praise Noboru Shigemura, a man whose genius gave us the winding tales of the Raccoon City era of Resident Evil that the series is still chasing and haphazardly adding to today. In the original scenario brief, the surviving stars report Umbrella to the authorities immediately after the end of the first game, and by the time that RE2 kicks off, the company has been shut down and the citywide outbreak is only caused by the continuing leak. Okamoto made Umbrella more bureaucratically corrupt than players realised, with them paying off the authorities to look the other way and even promising to sell the US government biological weapons. Okamoto used broad strokes of what was already there, but tightened a lot of screws and weaved things together to create a story that was much more engaging. Furthermore, his vision connected RE2 to the first title where Kamiya's did not, and he kept Umbrella around for the assumed future of the series. Claire Redfield enters Raccoon City searching for her brother Chris and discovers that he's no longer there, and Leon S. Kennedy proclaims that it's up to them to take down Umbrella. We've got sequels on the way, don't you worry. Now here's a big fat riff. The final version of Resident Evil 2 launched to even more universal acclaim than the first, recognised for improving on the formula in every way and outdoing all the pretenders to boot. The money invested into RE2 made it one of the most expensive games to that point, but it had no trouble making it back. Forget the video games industry, which Resident Evil 2 became king of the day of, it made more money in its opening weekend than any Hollywood movie with the exception of Titanic. All of this from a game that nearly stopped Resident Evil dead in multiple ways. The original draft of the scenario felt quite final, possibly informed by Mikami's dislike for sequels. It ensured that Umbrella was well and truly done and that the viral outbreak of Raccoon City remained contained. The story was meant to end here, and if the writing didn't put a full stop on Resident Evil, then the original design might have done. Whilst what's now called Resident Evil 1.5 by fans remains an interesting curiosity, it's pretty clear that it pales in quality compared to the final release. After all, there's a reason why the team went as far as to start from scratch after around a year of work. This was no easy choice. Capcom were making a bold decision. They could have so easily released a substandard product and used the name value to get by, but instead they took a huge risk. Like Strip Mahjong or Bowlingo. Goddamn Bowlingo. Had this restart of Resident Evil 2 not been the massive success that it was, Capcom would have been in trouble. With both the money and time put into it, RE2 needed to succeed to secure the future for the franchise. But Capcom never wanted Resident Evil to stagnate. Perhaps because they had seen the effects of previous franchises like Mega Man and Street Fighter's returns dropping through iterative sequels, or purely because they understood the speed at which gaming was evolving and that being on the curve was really important to relevancy. Relevancy evil. Or something. I don't know. Are you expecting me to be funny? Is that not obvious? That's not how this works? Not funny? The point is that with the PS1's time coming to a close, the company got to work on a next-generation game to reinvent the wheel. That game was the franchise-redefining, industry-changing, monster-suplexing Resident Evil 4. Yes, also Resident Evil 3 Nemesis and Code Veronica and all the other cool stuff that happened in the meantime, but I would like to get this video out sometime before Christmas, so let's just jump to the next time the Resident Evil almost imploded. Hey, future self, did I get this out in time for Christmas? Yeah, that figures. Which is, of course, coincidental. RE2 is proof positive that anything worth doing is worth doing right. For all of the applause, praise, plaudits, and more that Resident Evil 4 still receives to this day, and that's just from Dan Durkin alone, its greatest achievement was taking risks. To completely change the preconception of a beloved franchise is not just to play with fire, but to get a bit handsy with it. In the grand scheme of things, the Resident Evil franchise was only 9 years old when RE4 dropped in 2005, compared to today's nearly 30 years of history. That said, it had crafted its own identity very early on and refined it over time. Perhaps just as important was not just the Resident Evil games themselves, but the fact they had popularised Alone in the Dark's original blueprint and inspired batches of copycats. Even today, when it doesn't use that style, Resident Evil is still called the grandfather of survival horror. So point being, the walls were closing in on the franchise. It hadn't been shy to try new things, with 6 spin-offs coming in 4 years, but the main titles, Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, Code Veronica, 0, the remake of 1, and to be fair, 2 of those spin-offs, were all of a specific style. Tank controls and fixed camera angles. Resident Evil had Resident Evil'd so well over and over that it wasn't clear where the franchise could even go. As such, radical changes were needed. Defining what that radical change should be could have killed the franchise if it didn't pan out. Capcom needed to deliver, and to make matters worse, the adored RE4 was in development hell for years and was scrapped at least 3 times at various points along the way. Although maybe scrapped isn't the right word, as the first version of the game did actually release, of course, just under a completely different banner. Ding ding ding, we've hit the trifecta of surface level Resident Evil trivia that you most likely knew. Sweet Home, Resident Evil 1.5, and RE4 becomes Devil May Cry. Some of this is still very visible, in a sense, even with its distinct changes to the way the character moves and the sheer degree of action on screen. DMC still has a camera system that the player can't control, which feels like a logical continuation of Resi's experiments with tracking cameras and the likes of Code Veronica. It also just straight up shares assets between itself and the final RE4, coincidentally. But when it got too far from what Resident Evil had been for the last 5 years, Capcom started again. They found a line, they crossed it, and then they dialed back. DMC would obviously go on to be a success in its own right, so it was clearly the right move to allow it to spring forth as its own series, but time was spent on multiple different versions beyond this as Capcom tried and tried again to figure out the new direction for Biohazard. The second draft for Resident Evil 4, often called the Fog version, is where things start to take a little more shape. Leon S. Kennedy is picked as the playable character, Paul Mercier is cast in the role, he gets his now iconic jacket, but things have a decidedly different tone. This game was revealed to the public via a short trailer at Tokyo Game Show 2002 and hints at the story's focus on the precursor to the T-virus and Leon fighting off a viral fog and his own infection in a European castle in pursuit of Umbrella head Oswell Spencer. Importantly, it was clear at this point that the series was doing away with pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed camera angles for good, with some interviews at the time even suggesting it would swap between third and first person perspectives. Strangely though, the game shifted form again by E3 2003 as the developers showed gameplay footage of Resident Evil 4 in what is now called its Hookman form. This version never got far in terms of producing a plot line, but was more of a gameplay showcase, and it's an interesting halfway house between classic RE and the final RE4. In fact, it might have more classic RE DNA in it than was suggested in the prior Fog version, looking at the dynamic but still fixed camera angles. Despite all of these quite big changes, another version was briefly trialled as well, which would feature a return to the series staple zombies before Capcom looked at all of these half-finished ideas and finally said what we're all thinking. Stop, hang on, wait, I'm so confused. Resident Evil 4 went through so many different idea changes, some completely separate from others and some that continued parts of one into another, that it became a mess. Heads at Capcom needed to do something drastic, as this next game was massively important to the business. Of course, every major sequel is, but when coming to a new generation of consoles, perhaps doubly or triply so. Is triply a word? Triply's a word. And so we arrive at Mikami's only ever sequel. We don't know what deal Capcom struck with Resident Evil's original director to get him to return and, let's be frank, right the ship, but it paid off. Not that things were necessarily plain sailing from day one of this revision either, since Capcom's core decisions led to some of the team feeling unsure and demotivated. The camera was changed, zombies and Umbrella were out, and the balance of action to horror swung wildly in favour of jumping out of windows, headshots, and one-liners. Despite this, Mikami stayed course, and whilst the game released to much confusion from die-hard fans, and some even pushed back against the changes, it was undeniably fun to play, becoming a sensation that is buried under a pile of superlatives. RE4's huge success did immense things for shooters of its era, but for Capcom, it was needed to keep the franchise reinvigorated. And all through its nearly 30-year history, it's pretty clear that Resident Evil is a series that isn't afraid to take risks. They don't always work. I mean, heck, the average to terrible multiplayer games of Biohazard speak for themselves. Not you, Outbreak, we like you, Outbreak. But the beauty is in that Capcom are willing to do something. And we could keep going, of course. Despite the financial success of Resident Evil 6, the poor conversation around the game made the company stop development on early Resi 7 ideas that would have more closely followed RE6's style. We know literally nothing about this proto RE7 except that it existed, but Capcom made the careful and not easy decision to go back to the drawing board once more and come up with another way to approach the series. This time it was to lean into the appeal of virtual reality technology. Sure, Resident Evil 7 wasn't a revolution quite like RE4 was, but it was a needed refresher.
And hey! It stars a group of documentary filmmakers going into a spooky house, like Sweet Home, in first person, like Resident Evil was originally going to be. God, I love RE7.
But history tells us that RE7 won't be the last refresh for the franchise, as that's how it stayed relevant. Who knows what the future holds for Resident Evil 9 and beyond, and if Capcom will continue to produce more remakes as they have done across the 2020s, or what fills that gap when they stop.
One of these days it's possible that the risks the Resident Evil franchise takes will be devastating, but so far Capcom have proven time and time again that it's worth getting close to the edge to truly feel alive. Or undead, I guess. Hey, thanks for watching this rambling mini documentary on Resident Evil. If you liked it and you need more, here's me and Dan ranking every game in the series. You won't believe where we put that one. You know the one. Yeah. Anyway, have a good week.